Chapter 9 The Wind Hunt. After all, Mother Helma was not there the next morning, nor the next, nor the next. She did not come back for days and days, and days. Much happened before she returned, and much happened after, I will tell you. During the days the children roamed the forest, looking for their mother. They asked every one they could find whether he had seen her, the treeman, his daughter, the bird fairies, and the forest children. Not one of them had seen or heard of her since she went away. But they all said with one accord that she would surely come back in her own time. It was not wise to go seeking her so. She loved them, she would return. Wait and be patient, they said. Time will bring Helma. But they were forest people, who live long, long lives, and see far. Eric was an earth child, and Ivra was not all a forest child. So they found it hard to be wise, and wait and do nothing but trust Helma and know she would return. So they went wandering all the day. They did not go home for meals, even after a while, but ate with the tree man and his daughter or the forest children. Sometimes as they walked through the forest, looking all about, even up into the trees for their mother, they would suddenly burst into play. Tag, Ivra would cry, tapping Eric on the shoulder, and away she would fly, he after her, in a race that grew merrier and merrier as it ran on. Ivra darted and twisted away when Eric thought he had her, rolling down little hills on the snow crust, climbing trees, jumping brooks, until he was lucky enough to catch her by one of her pigtails at last, or snatch her flying skirt. Tag, then away he sped, and the game would go on for a happy while. But sooner or later they always stopped running, stopped laughing, and remembered why they were wandering the wood alone. Then they would call for Helma. Ivra's voice was shrill and sweet, and rang through the bare woods like a bird song. Eric's wavered a little uncertainly, as though he doubted whether Helma knew it well enough to answer, "Helma, Helma, Helma, oh Helma, Helma." No Helma answered. Sometimes a forest child came running to say, "We haven't seen her yet, Ivra, but we are watching." The bird fairies fluttered at the call and nodded their little heads uneasily. Children's voices calling for their mother was a sad sound, and made the kindly little creatures restless. One or two of them would fly to nestle in Ivra's neck and whisper, "Give her time, do not hurry her so, she will come back." But the children were losing faith. They went calling, seeking, and playing through the woods all the hours of daylight. At night Ivra told Eric world stories, world story after world story, until sleep made them forget. The 5th morning of their search dawned blue and clear and windy. "The wind creatures will be happy today," said Ivra when she opened her eyes and heard the wind pushing at all the windows of the house, and saw the blue morning sky. "Wild Star will be circling the world." "Why then, he will see Helma somewhere," cried Eric. Ivra sprang from her bed. "Eric, how splendid! We must go with him. Why didn't I think of it at the very first?" They did not stop for breakfast, but were into their coats and ready for the day's search in a twinkling. Neither of them had bothered to undress the night before. Ivor's hair had gone unbrushed for 2 days. Things like that are apt to slip when one's mother is away. So her little pigtails were no longer smooth and glossy, but frowsy and loose, and the rest of her hair was ruffled until it looked something like the bird fairy's soft plumage. Eric's head, too, was shaggier than ever, and a smudge from fire building had darkened one of his cheeks since the morning before. They had not bathed in the bird bath since Helma had gone away. They never seemed to have time, or else they were too sleepy. Now they no more thought of baths than they thought of breakfast. Eric followed Ivra, who knew all the ways in the forest, to the spot where Wild Star was most likely to be, if he was to be found at all on such a windy, perfect day. They ran earnestly, never slackening to skip or play, and soon they came in sight of some giant cedar trees near the edge of the forest. There were several wind creatures standing there, laughing in shrill, glad voices, pointing with their arms, and flapping their purple wings. Wind creatures are growing up boys and girls, with fairy hearts and strong, never-tiring purple wings. Remember, Wild Star was among them. But before the children had come up to them, the wind creatures suddenly joined hands, as they do just before flying, and started running down the sloping hill that ended the forest. For a minute Ivra was in despair. Now they are gone for the day to circle the world, and I shall never find Mother, she thought. But she did not waste any more breath running. She stopped short and lifted her voice, clear and insistent. Wild Star, Wild Star, I need you, don't run away, Wild Star. The wind creatures had reached the foot of the hill, running swiftly hand in hand, and their wings were already lifted for flying, but Wild Star, at the sound of Ivra's voice, leaned back suddenly on the hands he was holding, almost throwing his comrades on their faces, and breaking the line. He turned right about, swinging the others with him, and came leaping and running back. "What is the matter, little comrade?" he asked. "What is the matter? In all your flying around the world, Wild Star, you must have seen my mother Helma. She is lost. Oh, can't you tell us where she is?" "Yes, of course, but I didn't know she was lost. I thought she was visiting Earth friends." Truly, truly, Ivra's eyes shone with joy, and Eric grabbed his cap from his head and threw it up in the air, shouting, "Hurrah!" "Oh, will you bring her to us right away?" Ivra begged. Wild Star looked doubtful. Perhaps she wouldn't want to come. Ivra laughed merrily at that. "Then take us to her," she said, "and you will see how she wants to come when we ask her. Give us your hands then." They held out their hands. Ivra's was grasped by Wild Star's, and Eric's by another wind creature. With their free hands they clasped each other's. So the four started running down the hill, while the rest of the wind creatures flew off over their heads. Wild Star and his comrades ran faster and faster until Eric wondered how it was that he and Ivra were ever keeping up with them. Soon he realized that his feet were scarcely touching the ground. At the foot of the hill stood a little group of birches, and they were running right upon it. He did not see how they could either turn out or stop themselves at that speed. Almost as soon as he had seen the birches, though they were beyond them, they had not turned out. They had jumped right over the birches, and they were much higher than Eric's head. They were running so swiftly now that only their toes ever touched the ground, if they did. What fun it was to run like that, the wind at their backs, and the wind creatures drawing them strongly forward, faster and faster and faster, until they were really flying just above the snow. Across white fields they skimmed, over fences and frozen streams, bushes and banks, through orchards and meadows, on and on until they came to the town. There Ivra pulled back for a minute, and the wind creatures slowed down. Eric knew why Ivra was afraid of the town. She had told him all about it, while they played in the wood. Helma, her mother, was a human, but she hated the town, and loved the fairies and their ways. That was why she had run away to live by herself in the wood. But Ivra was neither fairy nor human. She was both. Now the fairies are afraid of humans because humans look right through them and do not see them. That upsets the fairies and makes them uncomfortable. Of course, Helma and Eric were exceptions, for because they had no shadows in their eyes, they could see them and play with them. So the fairies accepted those two as one of themselves. Ivra was different, because she was only half fairy. Any human could see her whether his eyes were shadowed or not if he would only look hard enough. The dreadful part was that when a human did see her, he was likely not to believe in her. He would just think he was daydreaming, and that the little girl with the soft eyes, the ash-colored pigtails, and the quick feet was just a piece of his daydream. Not to be seen is bad enough, but it is much worse to be seen and not believed in. That was why Ivra was afraid of the town. People saw her there and either rubbed their eyes and looked another way or laughed. But now she was going for her mother, and she could bear anything, even that. She did not hold back long. They ran past the canning factory, and Eric did not give a glance to it. A little girl looking out over a pile of cans saw him, however, and wondered at his warm suit of brown cloth, his leggins, sandals, and the cap with wings. She remembered him in rags. She saw Ivra too, and did not rub her eyes and think her a dream. But she did not call to any one in the factory or point, for she knew they would think it a dream. Through the crooked, narrow streets, past the crooked, narrow houses, one of them Miss Fragg's, they sped faster than the wind, on, up the wide avenue, through the residential section, where big houses eyed them from proud terraces. Out into the country again they raced. There they came to a high gray stone wall, blocking their way, and stood still. "You must climb," said Wildstar. "She is in there." Chapter 10. On the Gray Wall. It was a very high wall that hid their mother, and at first glance it seemed impossible that they could ever climb it. But Ivra did not stop to wonder. She ran up and down, hunting for a foothold. At last she reached the end of the wall and disappeared around the corner. Eric and the wind creatures followed. When they came up to her, she had already found a place where the stones were laid a bit unevenly, one on the other, and was half-way to the top, clinging with toes and fingers. "Bravo!" cried the wind creatures. Eric went up after her, often slipping back and bruising and scratching his hands and knees, but as resolute as his playmate. At last they gained the top. The wind creatures had flown up and were waiting for them there, sitting cross-legged, with their purple wings folded down their backs. The wall enclosed the garden of a very rich family. It was a formal garden, with straight walks, trellises, fountains, benches, and neat flower beds, laid out in squares and circles, now piled high with blossoming snow. Just as the children reached the top of the wall, the door into the garden from the stern gray mansion behind it opened, and through it came 3 people. First was a very tall lady, all wrapped up in furs, tails, and heads of the poor animals that had been slain to make them hanging from her shoulders and down her back. Even the children could see that her face was sour in spite of all its smiling. Then came a young man in a stiff, funny hat, carrying a cane, beating up the snow flowers with it as he passed the flower beds. And behind them walked Helma, with her gaze on the ground. That is why they did not know her at first. That and her very strange clothes. She was dressed all in velvet and fur, and her arms up to her elbows were hidden in a huge white muff. She swayed as she walked on weird little high heels, and the toes of her boots drew out to long points, almost like a goblin's. Her hat was a velvet affair, so awkward and heavy it seemed to weigh down her head, and her candle-flame hair was smothered under it. Is it any wonder that they did not know her like that? But when she walked close under the wall, and they heard her voice, they knew her, and the wind creatures had to hold Ivra from jumping down and throwing herself into her arms. "Wait," they whispered. From their high place on the wall they could look down on the heads of the 3 people, and hear all they were saying. They had never learned that it is not fair to listen that way. From all Helma said, they could plainly see she was a prisoner. She was pleading with the old woman. She was saying, "No, never, never. In 1,000 days and years will I ever be happy here. My place is in the forest. Oh, how these heels bother." "Silly girl," cried the old woman, smiling more than ever, and looking more disagreeable than ever at the same time. "Your place is where you were born in, a fine house and wearing clothes like other people. Heels, indeed! Did you expect them to do anything else but bother? Mine have bothered for 60 years, but you haven't heard me complain. Neither would I," Helma said, "if I didn't know about other kinds of shoes that don't hurt. Those sandals I wore when you caught me didn't hurt. Why can't I wear those, at least when I walk in the garden?" "Well, you might," began the old woman, a little more kindly, and smiling less, "if you promise always to put on the high heels before coming into the drawing-room." "No," said the young man sharply. let her once into the garden in her sandals, and she'll climb the wall and be off. I say that we give her no chance to escape. After she had been to 100 or so balls, and worn these beautiful and appropriate clothes long enough, she'll be glad of her luck, and nothing could drag her into the forest, believe me. Now Helma stopped pleading, and laughed at the young man. Do you think high heels, or even a hat that weighs down my head, like this horrid one, can keep me much longer from my little daughter, and that dear new little boy? What they are doing without me all this time, I wonder." She stopped laughing to sigh. The old woman took her hand not unkindly. "My poor dear girl," she said, "how many times must I tell you it is only a dream, that house in the woods, and the little girl and boy? They aren't really there at all, you know. You have dreamed them. Come, cheer up, be a brave girl. We have parties and good times enough here, if you will only get into the spirit of them, to make up for all your forest foolishness." Helma answered in a low, even voice, that showed well enough how sure she was of the truth of what she was saying. "No, they are realer than you. Ivra is realer than all the people in that mansion put together, cousins, uncles, aunts, guests, servants, and all. She is my little fairy daughter." "No," said the young man. The wings of the wind creatures on the top of the wall rustled just then in a gust of cold north wind. Helma threw up her head as at a familiar sound, and her eyes slowly lifted to the faces of the children looking down. For a minute she looked steadily at them, without believing, and then it was as though her pale face suddenly burst into song. But the old woman and the young man were not looking at her, and so they noticed nothing. The young man said, "The neighbors have talked about us enough already for all your queer ideas and doings, so you'll wear no sandals, no, nor sleep with your skylight open, as you're always asking, nor go one step outside the wall until you have come to your senses, and are more like other people, so there." But Helma laughed, her head thrown back, so that the children could look into her happy eyes, and see the glow of her short hair under her grotesque hat. "Keep your keys, cousin," she said, "and your old skylight keep shut tight as tight. I shall find a way out, but my children must be patient, and Ivra must teach Eric to keep his face and body clean. They must not forget meal times, and when anything goes wrong, or they think it is going wrong, they must ask the tree man's advice. I will find a way to them soon. They must keep happy and wait." She said all that slowly and distinctly, her eyes smiling into theirs. "What silly talk," laughed the sour old lady, "just as though you were making a speech. Well, it must be luncheon time now, and high time we were changing our frocks. Wear your gray velvet Helma, and don't forget to put on stockings to match. There's to be strawberry ice today, and goose to begin with, of course. Cook says she has never seen a tenderer." The old lady went on talking about the wonderful luncheon they were to have, until they were out of hearing. But the children on the gray wall could see that Helma was going indifferently from the way she had come out. Her head was high, and she stepped out in her funny high-heeled boots, as though she were walking in sandals. At the little door into the mansion she turned and waved. her queer great muff to the children and the wind creatures, and they heard her laugh. But when she was gone and the door was shut and locked, they heard the great key scrape. Eric turned joyfully to Ivra. She was staring intently at the closed door, her face very pale. Suddenly she buried her head in her arms and burst into sobs. Hoarse, jerky sobs. The first and the last time Eric was ever to hear her cry. Eric and the Wind children sat cross-legged and waited. Soon she stopped and wiped her face on her sleeve. "She is locked in, but she will find a way home," she said, almost laughing. How glad and how surprised she was to see us. It was almost as though she had begun to believe all their talk about dreams, until she heard the wind creatures' wings. The wind creatures took them back to the forest. Under the giant cedars they said goodbye and left them. The children went straight to the Treeman's to tell him the news. He gave them deep bowls of warm milk to drink, and took off their sandals so that their toes might spread and warm in front of the fire. Then the tree girl begged for a story, and Ivra told a world story about the rivers, how they go in search of their mother, the ocean, day and night, around mountains and through mountains, and across whole continents, and never stop until they find her, and of the myriad presents they carry to her, of the things they see and the things they do, as they flow searching. It was a long story, and almost before the end the little storyteller had fallen asleep, with her head tipped back against the treeman's chest. They spent that night in the tree, and that was good, for a storm had risen outside, and it was bitter cold in the forest. Chapter 11. The Beautiful Wicked Witch. The next morning Eric woke Ivra, slipped away to play with the forest children. On such wild days as this they usually play indoors, for there little things and the snow witches love to tease them, said the tree man. Perhaps she'll be telling them world stories, thought Eric, and so he decided to go to the little moss village too. For though Ivra had told him dozens of world stories by now, he always wanted to hear more. So after breakfast with the tree man and his pretty shy daughter, he ran out in search of Ivra. It was indeed a cold morning, blustering and raw. Eric felt chilled almost as soon as he was out of doors. Very soon he lost his way, for he had not been in the forest long enough to grow familiar with landmarks. Just when he was beginning to be a bit hopeless and pinched with the cold, he came to the big fir where the beautiful Wicked Witch lived. It stood green and comforting among all the bare trees of winter. Eric stopped to look, for now he remembered the beautiful Wicked Witch and the bird she had caged in there. He saw a door in the tree trunk ajar, and swinging to and fro with tiny tinkling music. He peeped in, and between the swingings caught glimpses of little blue and yellow flowers arranged in tight bunches in hanging vases. He could smell their sweetness even out there in the cold air. Then high up in the tree trunk a window opened, and he heard the bird singing. The beautiful Wicked Witch's face appeared at the window, looking down at him. Her black eyes were sparkling, and she nodded good morning to him as though he were a prince, or at least a grown-up. He could not help nodding back. He liked her very much. She was so beautiful and so friendly. "Come in and get warm," she called, "and I'll show you my pretty bird." Eric remembered Ivra's warnings but he wanted to go in so much that he found himself doing it. The door tinkled louder music when he touched it, and he pushed his way through, as a bee pushes his way into a flower. The witch came running, twinkling down a spiral stairway. She kissed his mouth, took off his winged cap and coat, threw them somewhere out of sight, and then he had time to look at her well. Her gown was green satin, the color of the fir bows, and her little sandals were green satin too. A green fur frond bound her forehead, and her black hair hung loose, soft and electric to her waist. Eric had never seen a prettier person in the world, nor one more kind. She took his 2 hands and began to whirl in a happy dance. Eric danced too, for joy and good comradeship. Round and round the room they whirled until their breath was spent. Then the beautiful wicked witch took him up the spiral staircase to show him the bird. Up and up they went, until they came to a little room high in the tree. The floor was carpeted with yellow satin, and yellow curtains hung at the window. Deep blue mirrors lined the walls, and they reflected Eric and the beautiful wicked witch dozens of times over. The pretty bird cage, all made of flowers and leaves, hung in the very middle of the room. Eric stood by it a long time. He put his fingers through the bars and stroked the bird's soft feathers, but the gorgeous bird paid no attention to him and did not sing. "Why doesn't it hop about?" he asked the beautiful wicked witch. The witch frowned and pouted. "It ought to, I'm sure. I like to see it hopping, but it would rather sulk. It thinks all the time about the forest and its mate, who is out there somewhere. Sometimes it sings, though. Its voice is wonderful." "Oh, let's open the cage and free him," cried Eric. But the beautiful wicked witch seized his hand. "No, no, no, it is mine. I have caged it in my pretty cage, and it fits into the room, don't you think?" "I don't know what you mean," said Eric. "Why, you fit into it too," said the witch, looking hard at him. "Your yellow hair and blue eyes match the yellow and blue flowers. Would you like me to make a pretty cage for you and put you into it?" No, no, Eric was suddenly afraid of the beautiful wicked witch, but she laughed at his fear and danced a little dance, humming to herself around the room. Then Eric noticed other cages. The walls were lined with them. Some hung from the ceiling, and some stood in corners. In every cage was a bird or animal. The one standing nearest to him had a pretty gray squirrel, running round and round on a wheel. He stopped every now and then to peer out through the bars with quick, bright eyes. In the cage next was a tiny brown field mouse, but he had given up running and playing long ago, and was huddled in the farthest and darkest corner of his cage, his little beady eyes opened and watchful. Eric walked around the room, looking at all the poor little animals and birds. One and all peered through the bars with watchful and fearful eyes. Eric remembered himself in the canning factory, and pitied them more than he could ever have done, had he not once been a caged little creature too. How he longed to open their doors and the window, and see them scamper and fly away. But the witch had stopped her dancing by the bird cage in the middle of the room, and her little hands were between the bars, stroking the bright bird breast. She was saying, "Sing for us, bird. Sing your nicest song for us. Little Eric wants to hear it." The bird began to beat its wings and breast against the bars. Again and again its bright breast struck the door, but it did not fly open. "It does not want to sing," laughed the beautiful wicked witch, "but it must. Sing, bird, sing. It does you no good to struggle. You can't get away. Sing, sing." Then the bird sang. Its song was truly wonderful, high and clear as Eric had heard it from outside. But now that he could see the bird caged, he did not like the song so well. It was all too sad. Eric wanted to go away then, out of the tree, and never see the witch again. He would find Ivra and the forest children, and forget all about these cages. So he said goodbye to the witch, and ran down the spiral staircase, but he could not find the door out. He went round and round the wall, but there was no sign of a door. It was indeed as though a flower had let him in, and then closed its petals tight. The little posies swung in their cases, the bird sang upstairs, and the beautiful wicked witch played and danced, and laughed at all his searching. She would do nothing to help him find the door. All that day he wandered upstairs and downstairs, or stood at the window, looking down through the green fir branches to the free forest floor. Once the witch offered to tell him stories, but he wanted no stories of caged things, and those were all the stories she knew. The witch did not mind his short answers and dark face. She seemed perfectly able to have a good time with herself, and needed no comrades. At last night fell. The rooms blossomed with candlelight. In the yellow room upstairs, the beautiful wicked witch paraded back and forth before the mirrors, loving her own reflection, smiling at herself, curtsying, frowning, looking back over her shoulder, lifting her hair to let it fall again in electric waves. Eric stood by the window, thoroughly weary of his search and loneliness, and watched her. The bird sat in the cage and watched her. All the little bright eyes of animals watched her. The candles burned steadily. How Eric longed for Ivra now, and their own big friendly room. He imagined Ivra in the room there, all alone, getting her supper over the fire, bathing in the fountain bath, opening the windows, and at last falling softly to sleep before the firelight faded. Oh, if there were only a window open here! How hot it was, and how over-sweetly scented! The beautiful wicked witch went on posing and preening before the mirrors, and seemed to have forgotten all about her new little prisoner. So he pulled back the yellow satin curtain and looked out. It was clear, cold starlight. He pressed his face against the window pane and stared down into the shadows beneath the fir. And there, standing erect in the shadow, her face lifted like a pale little moon, stood Ivra. She saw him, but did not wave. She only nodded, as though she knew now what she had come to make sure of. She stood still for a few minutes, until Eric almost thought she was frozen in the cold, but at last she moved and disappeared under the fir. Music tingled through the house. The beautiful wicked witch poised on her toes, surprisedly looking into the reflection of her own eyes. "Someone has come in, for that was the door," she said. "It opens inward with music." Eric's heart stood still. Had Ivra come into the witch's house? Ivra, who was so afraid of the witch. He ran down the stairs, and the witch followed him. Yes, Ivra stood there in the middle of the warm, flower-hung room like a little cold star-beam, but she did not look at the quaint flowers in their golden vases, and when the witch ran to her and kissed her, she did not even look at her. She looked only at Eric, and her eyes said, "I have come to free you." "Oh, so you did want to try on the pretty frock after all," cried the witch, and drew her up the stairs. Eric followed to the yellow room. "No," said Ivra, but the witch brought it out and tried to slip it over her head. It was sheerest gossamer web, and shimmered like moonlight, and the little rosebuds seemed to make it belong to Ivra. Eric forgot all about being a prisoner, and forgot the little caged creatures around the wall. He was delighted with the frock being pushed down on Ivra's shoulders. "How beautiful you'll be," he cried, but Ivra wriggled away from it and stood clear. Her rudely made brown frock and worn sandals looked odd in that satin room. "I didn't come to see the frock," she said, shaking her head till her pigtails bobbed. "I came to see Eric." The beautiful wicked witch laughed. "Get him if you can," she said. Then she turned her back on the children and began to braid her black hair among the mirrors. They went to the window and waited there, watching her. "The door doesn't open out, only in, I think," Eric whispered, "so we can't get out." "Mother has told me how it would be," Ivra whispered back. "We'll have to wait until she's asleep, and then find a way." Then Ivra sat down on the floor and began to rock back and forth and sing a lullaby. It was a lullaby her mother had sung to her all her babyhood. Ivra sang in a very little voice, almost a murmur only, but by listening Eric and the beautiful wicked witch could catch the words. She sang the same words over and over and over. "Night is in the forest, Tree Mother is nigh, by-a-bye, by-a-bye. Sleep is in the forest, his feathers brush your eye, by-a-bye, by-a-bye-bye. Mother's arms are holding you, forest dreams are folding you, by-a-bye, by-a-bye, bye." The beautiful wicked witch sat down before the mirrors, after a while, still watching her reflection, but listening to the song too. Her head gradually sank lower and lower, first resting chin in hand, and at last right down on her arm, stretched along the floor. Her face lay turned towards the children, and they saw the mirth slowly fade in her great black eyes. The lids drop lower and lower, and then she was asleep suddenly. Now she looked almost as young as themselves, and like a pale child who has fallen to sleep at its play. But the children did not stop to look at her. Once they were sure she was asleep, they were off searching for the door, up and down the stairs, and all around the rooms they ran on tiptoes, but it was no use, and at last they came back to the window. "We must jump," whispered Ivra. Eric looked down and wondered. It was a long way to the ground. "The snow is soft beneath the crust," Ivra said. "It will only cut us a little." "Let's take the bird," Eric said. Ivra ran to it and opened the cage door. It hopped onto her finger eagerly, and she held its bill so that it would not sing. Eric opened the window. "I'll jump first," he whispered, but Ivra Oh, let's hold hands and jump together. The beautiful wicked witch felt the cold night air from the window on her face and stirred in her sleep. Her eyelids quivered, so the children did not wait a minute more. They climbed up onto the windowsill, Ivra still holding the bird. 1, 2, 3, she whispered, and they jumped. Out and down they went like two shooting stars, and plunked through the snow crust. They were up in a second. Their wrists and elbows were a little bruised and cut, but they were not really hurt at all. But strange, the bird had fluttered near Ivra's hand for that second, and then flew straight back up and into the open window. It had been caged so long it did not really want its freedom after all. Eric cried out with regret. But Ivra seized his hand, and they ran home together through the cold, starlit forest. Before they leapt the hedge into their own garden, Eric saw the firelight blossoming in the windows, but he stood still outside the door. After Ivra had gone in for a time, breathing the cold air and the clear silence right down into his toes. Chapter 12. Ivors Birthday. Tomorrow is the shortest day in the year, Ivra told Eric one night after they were in bed. He did not answer, for he was very sleepy, but after a minute she spoke again. It's my birthday, too. Then he opened his eyes and sat up, for her voice sounded very queer and far away. He saw that she too was sitting up, her hands folded under her chin. Mother always had a party for me, she said. Such fun. Perhaps one will happen tomorrow, even with her away. Eric comforted. Oh goody, I do hope so. Perhaps. Anyway, I'm going to pretend there's a party waiting for me tomorrow. You pretend too, Eric. And then, even if it doesn't come true, we will have had the pretending at least. Eric agreed to pretend. It was one of his favorite games, and very soon the two children nestled down under their covers and drifted into sleep and dreams of a party. They were roused early in the morning by something tapping lightly on the doors and windows. Eric was out of bed first, and saw the wind creatures, 6 or more of them, looking in and beckoning. Their purple wings gleamed gold in the early morning sun. Wild Star was standing in the open door. Happy birthday, he cried, and tossed a snowball into Ivra's bed. She popped to her knees, laughing and rosy with sleep. But then she was grave in a minute. There's to be no party, Wild Star, she said. Mother's not back yet. Are you all here for that? Yes, we are here for that, and there is to be a party, an all-day one, too. Your forest friends have seen to that. The children were radiant with joy, and Ivra whispered to Eric, we had our pretending too. The wind creatures would not come in to breakfast, for of course they do not like indoors at all, and besides they need very little. Food, so they played in the garden while the children dressed and ate. Very soon the children were done, though, and came leaping out, ready for a day's joy. The wind creatures led them out through the forest. The tree girl was watching for them at her door. It was plain to be seen, when she joined them, that she carried something in her arms very secretly under her white cloak, but no one mentioned it. Ivra knew it must be a surprise for her birthday. Where the party was to be, no one told her, and she did not ask. She liked surprises. They came to the forest children's little moss village. The youngest forest child of all was the only one up so early. He was busily breaking dead twigs from bushes to build his morning fire, and making up a little rhymeless song about Ivors' birthday as he worked. "This is her birthday, Spring's little daughter, Spring's little daughter, this is her birthday. Wake now, all you forest children, wake for her birthday, and tie your sandals on." When he saw them he cried, "Hurrah, happy birthday, Ivra!" At his cry all the little windows in the little moss houses opened, and there were tousled heads of the forest children, their eyes blinking sleepily against the gilded morning light. Thank you, Ivra cried back to the youngest forest child. "Hurry and follow." Before they had gone on their way 5 minutes more, the forest children were up with them, tugging at buckles and sandal strings as they ran, begging not to be left behind. Soon they came to Big Pine Hill, a deep hill in the forest, with no trees but a giant pine at the top. The wind creatures had built a slide there by brushing away the snow and leaving a broad track of shining blue ice. Up under the pine were sleds enough for every one, made all of woven hemlock branches. They needed no runners, for the ice was so slippery and the hill so steep, anything would go down it fast enough. Ivra's forest friends must have worked all the day before to make those sleds, and now her shining face and clasped hands were reward enough. She was the first to try the hill. She threw herself on her sled, and down she flashed. At the bottom she tumbled off, and still on her knees shouted up to Eric and the others at the top, "Oh, it's splendid, come on." Then the hill was covered with speeding sleds. The bird fairies had none of their own, for they were so little they might have come to harm on that hill, but they had just as good a time for all of that, catching rides with the others, clinging to shoulders or heads or feet as it happened. Every one was there, even the snow witches, who had not been invited. They came whirling and dancing through the forest almost as soon as the sliding had begun. Ivra gave them glad welcome, in spite of their rough ways and stinging hair, for she, the only one of all who were there, liked them very well, and had made them her comrades, often and often on windy winter days. And they, who cared for nobody, cared for her. She is not like anybody, they explained it to each other. She is a great little girl. But they would not take Ivra's sled as she wanted them to. They had not come to spoil her fun. Instead, they raced down the hill behind her or before her, pushing and pulling, their stinging hair in her face, but that only made her cheeks very red, and she did not mind them at all. Then she tried sliding down on her feet, with the long line of witches pushing from behind, their hands on each other's shoulders. That was the best fun of all, and almost always ended in a tumble before the bottom was reached. Though the others avoided the witches as much as they could, they admired Ivra for such hardy comrading. Before noon every one was very hungry. Then the littlest forest child said, "Follow me, the tree girl has gone ahead." It was true she had slipped away when no one noticed. The littlest forest child led them away to a little valley place where hemlock boughs had been spread to make a floor and raised on 3 sides to make a shelter. When they had come close enough for Ivra to see what it was perched, so big and white, in the middle of the hemlock floor, she stopped and sighed with joy, while she clasped her hands. It was a beautiful frosted birthday cake, with 9 brave candles of all colors and burning steadily. Just the kind of cake her mother had always baked for her birthdays. Only last year there had been 8 candles. She had not hoped for this final delight. She ran quickly forward and was the first to kneel down by it. The tree girl was there waiting, and now Ivra knew it was the cake that she had been carrying so secretly under her cloak. The snow witches did not follow into that shelter. They have a great fear of shelters, you must know, for when forced into them they quickly lose their fierceness, and their fierceness is their greatest pride. But before they left the party, one of them came close to Eric, so close that tears were whipped into his eyes and quickly froze on his lashes. "Take this to your little comrade," she said, thrusting a box made of pine cones into his hands. "It's for her to keep her paper dolls in. We witches made it." Then all the witches went screeching and swirling away through the forest, and Ivra, Eric, and the others settled down to the business of eating the birthday cake. But first the tree girl, who was very sensible, insisted that they eat some nuts and apples. Indeed, she would allow no one a bite of the wonderful cake until he had eaten at least 1 apple and 20 nuts. Before Ivra cut the cake, the others blew out the candles, one after another, and made her a wish in turn for every candle. The tree girl wished her a bright new year, the bird fairies that her mother would soon return, the wind creatures that she would keep her gay heart forever, the forest children that she would become the most famous storyteller in the forest world. And then it was Eric's turn. He had never been to a birthday party before, and never had he made a wish for someone else. So he was a little puzzled, but at last he had an idea and cried, "I wish that your hair will grow golden and curly before tomorrow morning." All princesses Ivra had ever told him about had curly golden hair, and though she had never said it, Eric had suspected for some time that Ivra would like that kind of hair herself. Then he puffed his cheeks and blew out his candle, a fat green one. Ivra laughed. "The snow witches would never let me keep curly hair," she said. "They'd whip it straight in an hour." That reminded Eric of the pine cone box, and he gave it to her and told her about it. She was almost as delighted with that as with the cake. What a wonderful cake it was! Such food Eric had never dreamed of, and he was a great dreamer. The frosting was over an inch thick. Then of course Ivra must tell them stories. All the forest people loved her stories. They built a fire to keep from freezing. The wind creatures sat a little way off, where it was cool enough for their comfort, but not too far to hear Ivra's clear voice. This time she told all she knew about the birthday of this earth, one of the most magical and splendid and strange of her stories. But it was the shortest day of the year, Ivors' birthday, and night fell all too soon. Then the tree girl, who seldom forgot to be sensible, said they had better go home. The littlest forest child was already asleep, curled close by the fire. They roused him gently. Good nights were called, and a few minutes after, The shelter was deserted and the fire out, and by starlight could be seen many footprints leading away in the white snow out into all parts of the forest. Eric and Ivra walked toward home hand in hand. They had to pass the morning slide on the way. When they came in sight of it, they began to walk more quickly and quietly, and to look intently. The blue ice shone bluer than ever in starlight, but more than the ice shone, shining people were using the sleds, and the hill was covered with them. "Why, they must be star people!" Ivor cried excitedly. When they were quite near, they stood to watch. The strange star folk were very silent, never calling and laughing at those who had slid there in the morning had done. To a little boy and a young girl came spinning down on the same sled, and stopped so near that Ivra and Eric might have touched them by leaning forward. But the star two must have thought the forest two shadows, for they paid no attention to them at all. Now that they were so near, Eric could see that their hair was blue, like the shadows of snow, and their faces a beautiful shining white. Their straight short garments were blue like shadows too, and their arms, legs, and feet were bare, but they did not seem conscious of the cold. Eric did not hear them speak, but they looked at each other as though they were speaking, and then suddenly the little boy laughed merrily, as though the young girl had just told him something very amusing. Soon the girl turned and ran away up the hill, but the little boy was as quick as she and threw himself on the sled, while she never slackened her pace, but drew him straight and fast up the steep slope. "I have never seen them before," Ivor whispered to Eric, "but Mother has told me of them. They don't talk as we do, you see. They don't have to. They know each other's thoughts. They almost never leave their stars. Do you think perhaps tonight they saw our slide shining, and wondered so much about it they had to come down? Even Mother has never seen them. It was Tree Mother told her." Eric was very silent, for he had never seen such beautiful people. The little boy had had a face like a star, and great shining eyes. The young girl had been clear like the day, and without smiling her face had been brimmed with happiness. But now he felt Ivor trembling. She whispered again, "You know, Eric, it is wonderful for us to see them like this. Some day Mother says we may get to be like them." "And speak without words?" Eric asked, wondering. "Yes, and more than that. We may be as alive as they. Now we are only forest people, and not all that even, almost dreams. They are real." Then she shook his hand and drew him away. "I cannot look any more," she said. "Can you? They are too beautiful." Eric put his fingers to his eyes as he walked. "Yes, it's hard to see the ground now. My eyes ache a little. But how the children wished their mother were waiting for them in the little house to hear the tale."